Good afternoon. I'm finishing the reading of The Mystery of the Coniunctio, Alchemical Image of Individuation today by Dr. Edward Edinger. And so I'm going to be reading the commentary on the 10th picture from the Rosarium Philosophorum, which was published in 1550 and which Dr. Edinger felt covered the cycle of individuation, that is, the cycle of psychic development for the individual, for a couple, and also for any organized group, whether it be a Boy Scout troop or a church or a municipality or a state or a nation or humanity itself. So I'm going to read now from page 94, Resurrection of the United Eternal Body. The united body, combining king and queen, is now alive and erect, standing on the moon above the earth. In the right hand is a goblet that contains 3 serpents, one serpent with 3 heads, and each head is crowned. In the left hand, the wound around the left arm. In the left hand, and wound around the left arm, is a 4th serpent, likewise with a crown. Out of the earth on the left side of the picture is growing a tree, which Jung tells us is the sun and moon tree. That isn't obvious from looking at it, but other alchemical illustrations show sun and moon more clearly below. And so let me show you the more clearly. Okay, that's the more clearly. And on the other side is a single bird. The previous picture had 2 birds, but this one, just 1. Now, what does all that mean? At this point, I start to get vague and I must talk in symbols. It's really beyond our capacity to encompass what this image refers to. At the very best, we can just get hints about it. For one thing, it's a picture of the 3rd stage of the Coniunctio. You remember that the 3rd stage was the union of the united body, soul, spirit, entity, the purified and united body, soul, spirit with the unus mundus. It was a kind of cosmic union. And that's alluded to here by the fact that the figure is standing on the moon and has the sun and moon as fruit on the tree, so to speak. The idea is that the whole cosmos is a single organic process. Very occasionally, one gets a glimpse of that fact, but you get the glimpse and then it fades away again, and you're back in your everyday life. I think that's the implication of the sun and moon tree. The figure is standing only on the moon, although earlier the figures were standing on both the sun and the moon. I think this refers to the fact that the foundation of this united eternal body is the ego. Now, why do I say that? Because the opposites, sun and moon, carry with them the implication of heavenly and earthly. In comparison to each other, sun stands for heaven and moon stands for earth. That's because in antiquity, the moon was thought of as the first planetary sphere, and everything below that sphere, everything sublunary, belonged to the earth. Psychologically speaking, it pertains to the ego. To put it another way, symbolically, the ego is under the aegis of the moon. The moon is the first gateway the ego encounters on its journey up to the planetary spheres. And so in relation to the sun, for this figure to be standing on the moon tells me that this figure has, at its foundation, as its standpoint, ego matter, body matter. We're not going to say more about that bird. I don't know what it is doing there, except there's just one, so maybe the two birds in picture 9 got together, just as the body got together. But I don't know about that. Another thing I want to allude to are the snakes. We have the image of the 3 and the 1, or the 3 and the 4, once again. 3 of them are in one container, and the other one is uncontained, but all are crowned. And if we go back to picture 1, which is the only other picture that has a snake in it, there was no crowning there. What I think that alludes to is the transformation of the reptilian psyche. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. You know, the ground of our being is of that nature. It's reptilian. On unexpected occasions, it can jump out and strike oneself or others just like a rattlesnake. So the fact that the snakes in picture 10 are crowned, and also because 3 of them are contained in the vessel, I take to mean that the whole process of the Coniunctio that led to this point has brought the reptilian psyche into such a living connection with consciousness that it has undergone a transformation. And I think that's equivalent, to use a different symbolic terminology, to the transformation of God. It's the same psychological idea, basically. Question: are those wings behind the serpent? You don't see it very clearly, but the wings belong to the united body. Both sides have wings growing out of the arms, but the wing on the left doesn't reproduce very well. It's not that the serpent is winged, but that the arm is winged. This is a winged being, indicating that it is the product of sublimatio. That's the idea. Question: could you say something about sublimatio? Sublimation is an upward movement from below. It refers to a chemical event in which, if certain substances are heated, mercury is an outstanding example of this, they vaporize and then condense or crystallize on the cooler portions of the vessel. That is called sublimation or sublimatio. The Rosarium also includes another picture, a parallel to picture 10. It's a representation of Christ rising out of his tomb as a symbol of the Filius Philosophorum. That again. Okay, there it is. This is an example of the Christ lapis parallel that Jung discusses at length in Psychology and Alchemy. I understand this image in picture 10 to refer to the creation of a psychic substance that has a non-temporal or eternal dimension to it, a kind of incorruptibility. It is an expression of the product of an ego that has experienced the process of individuation. This necessarily has a certain hypothetical quality about it because it can't be demonstrated in any decisive, irrefutable way, but a great many images point to this idea, and I think it does no harm to state it explicitly. One can then entertain it and see how it feels, see how the unconscious responds to having it stated so explicitly. The idea is that if one lives life in the fashion represented by this series of 10 pictures, if one lives an alchemical life, one creates a product. And that product has a life and a quality and an existence beyond temporal existence. We have a lot of indications that the psyche transcends space and time. We don't know that the personal psyche transcends space and time, but we do know that the psyche does, and there are reasons to believe that the products of the ego's efforts can transcend space and time. To the extent that they achieve an impersonal quality, it isn't exactly the personal psyche that does that transcending, but it is as a result of the ego's opus. To conclude, I'd like to read you the poem that accompanies picture 10, in which this united eternal body describes herself. I'll read the whole thing, first to give you the overall flavor, and then I'll go back over some of the lines and make some remarks that may clarify them. So what isn't understandable in the first reading, I hope will become so. I hope will become so. Sorry, I had to have a little caffeine. I don't know if anybody noticed in the previous reading today that in the last sentence I sort of dozed off for an instant. And that's a function of how reading these things, and especially reading them aloud, is kind of self-hypnosis. And so it does happen from time to time that I'm reading and the ideas are so complex that my mind just goes just like in a hypnotic session, and then I have to wake myself up. And so here we are. So here's the poem. Here is born the empress of all honor, the philosophers name her their daughter. She multiplies, bears children ever again. They are incorruptibly pure and without stain. The queen hates death and poverty. She surpasses gold, silver, and jewelry. All medicaments, great and small. Nothing upon earth is her equal. Wherefore we say thanks to God in heaven. Okay, let me put her back on the screen here. Okay. Then she speaks. O force constrains me, naked woman, that I am, for unblessed was my body when I first began, and never did I become a mother until the time when I was born another. Then the power of roots and herbs did I possess, and I triumphed over all sickness. Then it was that I first knew my son, and we two came together as one. There I was made pregnant by him and gave birth upon a barren stretch of earth. I became a mother, yet remained a maid, and in my nature was established, therefore, my son was also my father. As God ordained in accordance with nature, I bore the mother who gave me birth. Through me she was born again upon earth. To view as one that what nature hath wed is in our mountain most masterfully hid. Four come together in one, in this our magisterial stone, and six, when seen as a trinity, is brought to essential unity. To him who thinks on these things aright, God giveth the power to put to flight all sicknesses as pertain to metals and the bodies of men. None can do that without God's help, and then only if he sees through himself. Out of my earth a fountain flows, and into two streams it branching goes. One of them runs to the orient, the other towards the occident. Two eagles fly up with feathers of flame, naked they fall to earth again. Yet in full feather they rise up soon, that fountain is Lord of sun and moon. O Lord Jesus Christ, who bestowedst the gift through the grace of our Holy Ghost, he unto whom it is given truly understands the Master's saying entirely, that his thoughts on the future life may dwell. Body and soul are joined so well, and to raise them up to their Father's kingdom, such is the way of art among men. Okay? Yeah, okay, so moving on. This is a description of the Philosopher's Stone. It is also a description of the eternal conscious body that I tried to outline a moment ago. Now let's look at a few of the specific statements and see how they would apply psychologically. Quote, the philosophers name her their daughter, unquote. More often the philosophers, the alchemists, name their stone, which is the united eternal body, shown in picture 10, their son, but the meaning is the same. Daughter seems more relevant here, doesn't it, since it's standing on the moon. She bears children ever again. This is a reference to the Multiple Katia, which is an amazing and important aspect of the Philosopher's Stone. The idea is that once the Philosopher's Stone has been made, it has the power to replicate itself. If you take a bit of Philosopher's Stone as a very fine powder and throw it on a base matter, it turns whatever it touches into more Philosopher's Stone. It multiplies itself. I think this is a very significant symbolism. I think this is a very significant symbolism psychologically. It says to me that every time an individual has succeeded to some extent in achieving a relation to the self, that achievement has a tendency to be contagious, to affect others, to multiply. Of course, it has to meet matter that's open to matter that's open to receive it in order to Multiple Katia to take effect. In order for the Multiple Katia to take effect, but I see it happening all the time. Okay, quote, they are incorruptibly pure and without stain. I would understand this to mean that the eternal body is not contaminated by unconsciousness. The symbolism of purity, in psychological terms, means that we are conscious of our dirt, not that we, The symbolism of purity in psychological terms means that we are conscious of our dirt, not that we don't have dirt, but it's purified because we're conscious of it, and that makes all the difference. Quote, she surpasses all medicaments, great and small. That would refer to the healing capacity, the ability to make whole. Quote, and I triumphed over all sickness. This would correspond to one of the synonyms for the Philosopher's Stone, which is panacea, the cure of everything. Now, what does that mean psychologically? It certainly does not mean that contact with the self makes one immune to sickness. I think it means rather that all vicissitudes of life, including illness, become meaningful when experienced in relation to the self, and therefore promote the experience of wholeness. They don't bring about dissociation. So it isn't so much that one is immune to sickness or death, which is certainly not the case, but rather that such experiences are part of the meaningful whole, and one is healed in the midst of sickness, so to speak. Quote, then it was that I first knew my son, and we two came together as one. There I was made pregnant by him, and he gave birth. Therefore my son was also my father. This is a remarkable section which I understand psychologically to refer to the relation between the ego and the self. The self gives birth to the ego initially. The unconscious self gives birth to the ego, which is then the major seat of consciousness for a period of time. Then, if the ego earnestly pursues a relation to the unconscious, and there develops the kind of sequence that the Rosarium pictures represent, the effect is that the ego, the son of the unconscious, becomes the parent of the regenerate or reborn self. This is a psychological incest, that tabooed subject. Freud discovered the incest archetype, but understood it only personalistically. Jung discovered its transpersonal level. The Philosopher's Stone is a product of incest, a crime on the concrete level and a sacred mystery on the inner psychological level. For the Philosopher's Stone to say, my son was also my father, is a quaint way of putting it, but it makes sense when you think of it that way. It emphasizes the crucial importance of the ego for success of the opus, and this is one of the special features of the whole alchemical enterprise that is unique to the Western psyche. Even when the alchemists maintain that the opus will only succeed Deo concedente, that is, with the will of God, God willing, and with an appropriate religious attitude, Nevertheless, there's no question that the opus will ever take place by itself. It has to have an alchemist. It has to have an alchemist, an ego. And indeed, some of these alchemists were very profound examples of lifelong service and commitment to the process. Therefore, the product of the process was entitled to be called the son or daughter of the alchemist. Quote, none can do that without God's help, and then only if he can see through himself. These two lines are quite striking and overtly psychological. For this particular author, anyway, it was perfectly clear that self-knowledge was an essential ingredient of the opus. Quote, two eagles fly up with feathers of flame. Naked they fall to earth again." Unquote. The two eagles flying up with feathers of flame, falling to earth and then rising again, Phoenixlike, is an image of the combination of sublimatio and coagulatio, which is what takes place in this sequence of pictures. The descending dove in pictures 2, 3, and 4 is an image of coagulatio, of a spirit entity that descends into earthly existence and incarnates. And then the ascending homunculus in picture 7 is an image of the upper sublimatio movement, which is followed by another descent in pictures 8 and 9. So altogether, it is a representation of the circulatio, a repeated circuit of all aspects of one's being, which gradually unites the opposites. Hello, hey kid. Want to buy some meaning? I have just come down for dinner with family after reading this chapter. Decided to jump on your live stream as I open YouTube for a post-meal cigarette. Freaky yet pointlessly seeming synchronistic. Well, let's hear the meaning. Go ahead, by all means. And I'm just going to finish here. The final words in this profound poem are these. He unto whom it is given understands the Master's saying entirely, that his thoughts on the future life may dwell. Body and soul are joined so well, and to raise them up to their Father's kingdom, such is the way of art among men. That I understand, to use the ecclesiastical imagery the alchemists were familiar with, as an expression of the creation of the eternal body. Thoughts on the future life refers to the eternal, non-temporal dimension, and to raise up the fruits of one's effort to the Father's kingdom. Likewise indicates a translation of the consequence of the life of the ego into the archetypal dimension. As I see it, the fruits of the life of a person who has lived through this process can be deposited in a kind of archetypal treasury and provide an increment to it. The Father's kingdom, so to speak, is thereby augmented by the alchemical efforts, the individuation process of the individual ego. And that task, I believe, belongs to each one of us. Okay. So that is it. That is the end. I've been reading The Mystery of the Coniunctio, Alchemical Image of Individuation by Dr. Edward Edinger, and that's the completion of picture 10. So now the entire cycle of the Coniunctio is available to you in these 10 commentaries in the playlist. And so Mr. Caleb NMH says, hey, Skip. Hi. Okay, Alex Kamaguras. One should entertain the possibility that neither the contraries nor the complementaries engender the opposites. Okay. And then what would that suggest? It seems like, Alex, when you say neither the contraries nor the complementaries engender the opposites, that suggests that somehow the opposites just passed over and didn't get differentiated and didn't become opposite. I think that would be normal in people in the first half of life. In fact, I've actually been surprised. I've been in contact with some young people who are in their 20s, let's say, recently, And I'm quite impressed that they seem to be well and truly into the individuation process, which in Dr. Jung's time didn't begin to age 35 or 40. So it does seem that because we have access to this material, that some young people in the 21st century are entering the individuation process, which is handling the opposites much earlier than at Jung's time, it seems to me. I make that observation, but anybody else? So, okay. Seeing no more, I'm going to sign off for today. Tomorrow, we are going to proceed with paragraphs 11 and 12 of Psychology of the Unconscious during the general group meeting, which begins at 8 p.m. Eastern U.S. time tomorrow evening, our regular group meeting. And on Wednesday, we will be completing our 32 session cycle on ion, and we'll be discussing what it means to the various members who are present at that time. And so if you're not a member of our advanced reading group, we do ask a $10 donation per month in order to participate in that. And so I hope you can join us. And in order to do that, you have to write an email to skip.conover@gmail.com so that I can get your regular email address. This is a requirement of Dropbox, not my requirement. But then you would have access to all 32 sessions that we did on ion. And then the following week, February 6th, we will begin about a 1-year seminar on Mysterium Coniunctionis. It's going to be a major task, and it will be a big undertaking, and I look forward to some of you joining us in that. Piste Kid, it is not surprising that the lapis Christ parallel came to the fore among the medieval Latin authors at a comparatively early date, since alchemical symbolism is steeped in ecclesiastical allegory. Yes, absolutely. And that's what we run into throughout all of Dr. Jung's alchemical writings, particularly volumes 12, 13, and 14. That those are Psychology and Alchemy, Alchemical Studies, and Mysterium Coniunctionis, but they also include Ion, which is volume 9-2 of the collected works of C.G. Jung. And it's important to understand that in no way are we suggesting that alchemy is about making physical gold, and only charlatans would suggest that that's the case. Alchemy was about a psychological process. It may have been unconscious to the alchemists, but this is what they were doing. So alchemy became the precursor to chemistry, but from Dr. Jung's side, we can see that they are, the alchemists are working on creating the psychological gold, which is the Filius Philosophorum, the lapis Philosophorum, which means the essence or quintessence of the human being. And once you have experienced that, and you do that normally through a religious experience of some kind. It does not have to be a Christian religious experience. It might be an experience which seems quite secular, or it might seem to be an experience within Islam or within Hinduism or Buddhism. You name it. But once you've had that experience, then you know, and you have access to the psychic gold, if you will. Okay. And Alex gives us the Latin phrase which appears over Dr. Jung's door in Kusnacht, Zurich, which is vocatus acque non vocatus Deus aderat, which means whether called or not, God will be present. And Martin says, thanks for your read. Okay, so now you have the full cycle, and every time you think you need to revivify your understanding of these things or see where you are in the cycle, you can go back to this playlist and play the commentary on the 10 pictures and understand how you can hold yourself together. And as I've said many times, Dr. Jung's work has helped me hold myself together very dramatically over the last 32 years. Every time I get into a psychic box somehow, I simply pick up Dr. Jung's work and start reading it, and it immediately brings me back to myself, and so therefore I find it very helpful, and I'm not drugging myself to get to it other than caffeine. As I said, sometimes these ideas are pretty challenging to the Western mind, and I do acknowledge that, because as you read through some of these things, they can be simply overwhelming. For example, chapter 5 of Ion, which the title of which is Christ as a Symbol of the Self. And I said like this the first time I read it: "You mean Christ the Son of God? What are you saying, Dr. Jung?" And I kind of bounced off it, as Jordan Peterson is wont to say about Dr. Jung's work, that many people just bounce off of it. And I've had many experiences of bouncing off of it, but as I have had those experiences and been persistent, then I get in a little deeper each time. And so to the point where now I've created this YouTube channel with quite a rich content of Dr. Jung's oeuvre, and from a layman's point of view, commentary on it. I do not claim to be a mental health professional, and I don't try to analyze anyone among my subscribers, but at the same time, I've always felt that Dr. Jung became my shrink. When I got deep enough into this work, he really guided me, even though we weren't together in time and space. And if you are patient and persistent with it, you can open what he was talking about. And for example, I've had a series of problems with religion, as a number of you may remember from my vision of Mephistopheles and other experiences. And finally, Dr. Edinger put into context for me that Dr. Jung found the source of all religions, and so that helped me quite a lot, because I had spent so much of my life
in countries that were not Christian. And I've been to the five biggest Muslim countries in the world, and spent a lot of time in them, and among other things, plus living in Japan, where Buddhism and Shintoism are very big, and so it can be overwhelming if you don't appreciate how these things fit together. And so I'll give you the link to Dr. Edinger's talk, in which he talks about Dr. Jung's work providing the source of all religions. It's very helpful to understand that. And I'll also share my vision of Mephistopheles, which was one of my run-ins with the Christian faith. And so nowadays I'm with Dr. Jung. I no longer need to believe, because I know. And I know when I saw him say that on the video clip that's available to you, if you want to go look for it, just put in Carl Jung, I have no need to believe, or something like that, and you'll find this 1-minute clip. But when I saw that, it just clicked for me, and I said, oh yeah, I know too. How about that? And then I said, okay, so what do we know? And that's what I've been trying to help people with for quite some time now. Alex says, are the prophet and the martyr bound by an indisposable synergy or syndactical proportions? Can this been made evident as the Jungian hypothesis that the fool is a worthy precursor of Christ? Well, that's very deep, Alex, and I'm not sure anybody's going to understand how I would respond to that. I am not familiar with this term synecdochical. I suppose it might be a theological idea. Yeah, I think that from a Jungian psychology point of view, the fool in the tarot does represent the opposite of Christ, because the fool is normally regarded as an infant or a newborn who steps off into life. You know, when a child is brand new, they're stepping off a cliff. They have no idea where they're going. And so if you look at kind of any tarot card or tarot deck at the fool, you'll see a person stepping off of a cliff with a pack over his back on a stick. And so that fool is completely ignorant, doesn't know, has no experience with life. And on the other hand, Christ represents the other end of that spectrum, which is having pretty profound experiences with life, including the self or the God image telling him that he was the Son of God. I'll leave aside the metaphysical aspects of that for the moment. And telling him that he had to live through this life as and accept crucifixion, which was the logical result of that. And so when we're asked to live in a context of imitatio Christi, it doesn't mean we're going to go and stretch our arms up on a cross or be crucified in the literal sense. It means that we have to live life, and unlike Peter Pan and the Lost Boys, who refused to grow up, we have to get a life and go out and live it. So when we're young and we're going to school, we don't quite understand that. We're just learning the basic foundations of what human life are, and we're getting a little ways down the road. And in early life, as Dr. Edinger says, Mother Nature is imperious, and what he means by that is Mother Nature is going to make you reproduce whether you like it or not, man or woman. And so, most people end up reproducing by the age of 30, let's say. And then you're well and truly launched in life, and you're having real experiences, because once you have the experience of being a parent, you realize that you're not in charge anymore, because infants tend to think that they're little kings and queens. I mean, they don't think it consciously, but they're in charge, and they have to be taught that they're not in charge, and here are the parameters of life. And so you get beyond that stage where you've done your duty to regenerate, and then you have to live for another 60 years these days. And so, so now what are you going to do? And so you have to get into life. You have to get a life. You have to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes. And the more time you go through the Job archetype, which I keep mentioning, the stronger your ego becomes, and the better able you are to face the slings and arrows of life. And and in the case of this Coniunctio, it's really representing this image that's over my right shoulder here. It's really representing the fact that when you're married, you actually become one entity, not only because your children are flesh of your flesh and body of your body, etc., but also psychologically, you and your wife are sharing one human wholeness, okay? Because psychic energy, libido, and by the way, libido does not mean sexual energy in Jungian psychology. It means psychic energy. And psychic energy is developed by the opposites. And so there are so many opposites in our psyche, and those opposites are causing psychic energy all the time. And in order for that to work well in any human life, you need to have a counterpart partner, and normally that's a man and a woman, but it can just as well be gay partners. But the idea is that your partner brings your other half, like the yin yang symbol, and so that helps you have a more complete life. And so they're the part of you that you aren't in that psychic energy. And and it's whether man or woman. This is doesn't require you to be one or the other. It's just, if you're going to have a wholeness, then you're going to have a partner who helps you experience that wholeness. And yourself, your
deepest archetype in your unconscious is always trying to make you experience what you have not. So I can vouch for my mother, because when she was 82 years old, she was having some problems. We took her to the doctor, and the doctor told her that she had pancreatic cancer. And she said, "Oh, cancer. I haven't done that yet." So in other words, she said, I haven't experienced that yet. And so your psyche is trying to get you to experience life completely. And, my mother didn't know anything about this stuff. So she said that spontaneously to me and the doctor. And she truly lived it. I mean, she lived on for another 4 months, but she never let it get her down. It was just an experience that she was having in life, and she had many other very good experiences in her lifetime. And, and like many people, she got to travel and experience many different things because she was married to a naval officer. So she experienced living on the seacoast, living in the Mojave Desert, living in Kodiak, Alaska, living in the fruit belt of Michigan, and finally retiring in upstate New York, and back in the snow again. And so and also living in Japan. And so because she had all those experiences, she had a very full life. And so when it came time for her to have cancer, it didn't trouble her greatly. She said, "Well, I haven't experienced that yet. Let's experience that." And by that time, many of her friends had experienced it and died of cancer. And so, she knew it was going to be her time sooner or later. And so here it comes, bring it on. So she was definitely a force of nature. But I don't know. I hope I answered your question, Alex. Yes, the fool and Christ are opposites. Martin, the hero's journey starts as a fool. And keep in mind, Martin, that the hero's journey is only the first half of life, okay? That's the life in the physical world, and you get all your accolades, and the first half of your life ends with getting some prize, like Luke Skywalker having this big ceremony where they pin some medal on him. But I've had a few medals pinned on me too, and whether you get that medal out of from some heroism or from a Cracker Jack box, after you've achieved that heroic feat, you have to go on with your life. And that's when the spiritual journey starts. And so the second half of these pictures, the pictures 6 through 10, are really about the spiritual journey. And Corey says the hero is not too far from a fool himself, because he goes out to the call of adventure in order to find himself, always at the end foolishly returns to the beginning. Yes, because we go through these cycles multiple times, and you may be in the cycle in 5 different ways in any given moment. Alex says there are tides in invading perambulation around the circumjacent oracle mound, which besmirch the very impossibility of immortality that the living proclaim to instill upon their dead. Well, that's a mouthful, Alex. I'm not sure I understand what you're driving at there. But what I would say is that, um, physical human life is one thing, but the dead do continue to live on in us. And, I know I lost my brother 30 years ago when he was 39 years old. And, he still lives in me just as clearly as he ever did today. And, I'm sorry his physical body is no longer with me that I can share things with him further, but certainly his life informs mine and is immortal in me, and we cannot say how that combination of his life and my life might have influenced my grandchildren, for example, who he never met. But so, our lives are informed by the dead. And the other example I would give is the lives of my first American ancestors, who, as many of you know, came to the New World to escape a religious war between the Protestants and the Catholics. And so now we can look back on that time ruefully, look back to the history of that time, and see what it tells us about how we should live in the world today, because obviously Catholics and Protestants aren't fighting one another anymore. And I was raised in a Protestant family, but it so happens that I live in Maryland, which was a Catholic colony of the United Kingdom or of England, because Henry VIII wanted to have 6 wives, and the Pope wouldn't let him, so he said, "Screw you! I'm going to have 6 wives," and left the Catholic Church. And the result was that there was a lot of animosity between Protestants and Catholics in Britain, and therefore many Catholics came to Maryland. And so if we know these things, then we know how these things came to be. And even if we're not conscious of them, if we're unconscious of them, somehow the way we are in the world as Americans among one another is affected by that history. And so it does live on. And so Corey says the wise might not need to use enlightenment as an excuse to go out and adventure. Yeah, I agree. Alex says, how can the poor in spirit sustain Abraxas during such adversity? That is the rub. Okay, and I'm not a mental health professional, and so I don't think I have a definitive answer for you on that one. I think it would probably be worth your time to listen to the 7 Sermons of the Dead, which I read into the channel a couple of weeks back, and you can find on the front page of the channel where Abraxas is presented. And the best way would be this: go through the Job archetype as many times as you possibly can, because that will build up your ego, and that will allow you to face the slings and arrows of life. So the Job archetype, I'll just
write it out here just in case there's any new people, is contest, defeat, lamentation, rebirth. Okay, now that's a cycle, and the more times you go through that cycle, the stronger you become. And the stronger your ego becomes. And then Abraxas, being this all-consuming God, you can learn where Abraxas fits in your life by going through that. And, the strange thing is that Jungian analysts actually joke about it when what they want is for you to come to them with a defeat, with a big defeat, because you're not going to change or be benefited if you haven't been defeated. You're still going on. And one can ask what happens to a person like our president, who basically was born with a silver spoon in his mouth and very rarely had anybody say no to him during his whole career. And suddenly now he's at the top of our government, and he hasn't built up the strength of his ego properly. And you can see the consequences of that in a movie called Florence Foster Jenkins, who had a very similar experience. And it's a movie that has Meryl Streep in it, but Florence Foster Jenkins was a very wealthy woman who never had anybody say no to her, and she kept thinking that she could be an opera singer, which she couldn't, and but no one would say no to her because she was giving so much money to the Metropolitan Opera in New York, and so they never said no to her. And it got built up and up and up until her husband rented Carnegie Hall for her for one night. And the upshot of it was that she came to know that her singing was not splendid, but then the irony became that the gift shop at the Met says that the most popular recording in their collection in the gift shop is the recording of Florence Foster Jenkins singing. And so go figure, things happen funny in life. And so, in terms of our president now, I have no idea how things are going to come down for him, but my impression is that because he didn't have people saying no to him all along, that the no's that he's hearing now are, very painful, very painful. I don't think there's anybody, whether you're for or against him, I don't think there's anyone who would say that he's having a good time being president of the United States. And so, that's sort of an example. And Corey says, that's why a wise one is often pictured as a hermit. Well, yeah, I guess. Hero is like a teenager. Yes, I would say that. You think you're a hero, and in my case, I joined the Marine Corps, and, thinking we were so heroic when we all joined, but, shortly after I joined, within a year and a half, one of my very close friends was killed in Vietnam, and so that changed a lot of perception, that's for sure.
I guess it's not always the hermit, Corey, because, I'm sharing my experiences with all of you, and I'm not a hermit about it. I am an introvert, so I don't go out and shout it from the rooftops, but nonetheless, I'm also not sitting in a corner sucking my thumb. Martin says, do you think that tree is the phases of life upward? Perhaps the 7 with paths are inner and outer. Yeah, I hadn't counted up the branches, but yes, you're right. There are 7, and that's a very astute observation. I appreciate that, Martin. Corey says the hero tries to vanquish his dragons, and so doing destroys himself. The wise tame their dragons to do one's biddings. Yeah, and so let me see if I can show you the dragons here, because this is a favorite. Somewhere I have it. I'm not sure it'll show. Ah, yes, it will show. Okay, just a moment. Okay, so this is one of my favorite alchemical pictures, and this was done in 1582, and so what it shows us is psychic energy in the form of our instincts as the dragons in a bottle, and they're bottled up, but they're very much alive, as they are within all of us, and around those bottled up instinctual energies, society thrives. And so the point is that you can't just let your instincts run amok. You have to be conscious of your instincts and use them in sensible ways, but not kill them. You can't kill them either. You have to, because your life depends upon them. And if I can find, yes, I'll very quickly read you something. Okay, so actually this image does appear in this book, which is called Psychic Energy. It's by Esther Harding, and the very first paragraph in her book is very apropos for this moment. And so before her first paragraph, this is in the introduction, there's a quote. And the quote is, "The forms that swim and the shapes that creep under the waters of sleep." And so then the first paragraph, which is very poignant, and I highly recommend it, the whole book, and the book is available in our Dropbox. And here's the quote. "Beneath the decent facade of consciousness, with its disciplined moral order and its good intentions, lurk the crude instinctive forces of life, like monsters of the deep, devouring, begetting, warring endlessly. They are for the most part unseen, yet on their urge and energy, life itself depends. Without them, living beings would be as inert as stones. But were they left to function unchecked, life would lose its meaning, being reduced once more to mere birth and death, as in the teeming world of the primordial swamps. In creating civilization, man sought, however unconsciously, to curb these natural forces and to channel some part, at least, to their energy into forms that would serve a different purpose. For with the coming of consciousness, cultural and psychological values began to compete with the purely biological aims of unconscious functioning."
So that sort of sums up everything we need to know about Jungian psychology, all in one place. Let me go back here. So Christ says the ego is driven by passion, which is defined by suffering. Yes, all religious traditions talk about suffering also. And, that's one of the, one of the fundamentals of life. In Buddhism, it's, the beauty of human birth, the certainty of death, all samsara, which it means suffering, and the fourth point is karma, which is what goes around comes around. And Johnny Depp had it in Don Juan DeMarco, where he said his lines were, I'm not attributing such wisdom to Johnny Depp, but maybe he has it, I have no doubt. But he said, only 4 questions make any difference in life. What is sacred? Of what is the soul made? What is worth living for? And what is worth dying for? And the answer to all 4 is the same. It's love. Okay, so anyway, for what it's worth. Alex says, the labyrinth is not a trope aimed toward escape. It's an ideal setting to confront the great beast itself. Ariadne would have to wait for the outcome to arise. Yes, and life has gotten quite a bit more complicated since Ariadne's time. And, I don't envy young people. Young people are better off if they're in the United States and have a little bit more knowledge. But young people, let's say in, I don't know, Saudi Arabia or Africa, who have come up not developed up into a modern society as most of us have, they have huge confusion because they just have no idea how to relate to the modern world. And that's why you need a Ariadne's thread so that you can relate. And he says, Alex says, socialism, I think you're saying socialism, is more treacherous than nescience, imitation even more so during such profound phenomenological processes of individuation and its renunciation. Well, Alex, I think that you would do much better to use 50-cent words instead of $50 words, because your meaning gets lost in these profoundly deep psychological words that you use. So I would urge you to try to find a way to say what you want to say without being so opaque, okay? And because you've misspelled the first word in your statement, unless that is the spelling, in which case I do not know this word. It's just not very clear to me. I'm sorry. I'm not up to that level. Nicholas says, the story, The Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, is a story about the second half of life, but it is also a Grail story. M. Esther Harding, a Jungian, wrote Journey into the Self. Yeah. Okay. So the Grail story is a valuable story of individuation, and people didn't understand it. So So, as recently as the Nazi period, there were people running around looking for the Holy Grail, and the Holy Grail isn't out there, it's here. Corey says, you're not a hermit, but the archetype is pictured as one. Well, my two main functions are hermetic and Hephaestus, Hermes and Hephaestus. So if you look at the books by Jean Shinoda Bolen, Goddesses in Every Man, or Every Woman and Gods in Every Man, you can pretty much figure out where you fit in that complicated cast of the Greek gods, which are actually archetypes. And so I read that long ago and understood that my role is twofold. One is to bring ideas up from the unconscious, which is what Hermes did. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm doing this website. And the other is Hephaestus, or Vulcan, at his forge, who is building things. And so, again, here I am building this YouTube channel. And so that's my Hephaestus function. And so if you want to understand yourself better, whether you're a man or a woman, you should go out and look at both of those two books so that you can not only understand yourself but others in an interesting take on psychology. Martin says, Skip, as an intuitive and thinker, would play a role as the magician. Yes, I'm definitely a magician. I've actually been accused of that in business. And it's not that I'm so magical, it's just that I'm not afraid to do things others are afraid to do. And so that creates magic. I can tell you a quick story. In the 1980s, the early 1980s, I went to Japan in business for the first time, and my company was making woven product that is used in automobiles. And in this case, it was a woven strip about this wide that had Teflon thread actually woven into it as the pile on this fabric. And Toyota was having a problem with its windows going up and down on their cars, and they would squeak. And the reason that they would squeak was that they had inside the doors of the cars, they had put these little wheels that were nylon wheels, and it would be in a metal flange. And so every so often these nylon wheels would wear out, and then the window would get scrapes and all kinds of stuff and make a lot of noise. And so I walked into Toyota one time with a Japanese partner, and I showed them this Teflon, and immediately they placed an order for 80,000 meters of the stuff, which it was $1 a meter at that time. And what they did was, instead of putting little wheels in the doors, they put a flange in the door and then just glued this Teflon to the flange. And so now the windows go up and down between two pieces of Teflon pile, which I introduced them to. And so afterward, my partner called me a quote-unquote lucky boy. Well, there was no luck about it. It wasn't any particular magic, but it was magical in the sense that it was a step that the Toyota engineers couldn't imagine. They couldn't imagine using a piece of pile fabric instead of this mechanical solution that they had been using for years. Nicholas says, I just about posted my comment right as you brought out the book Psychic Energy. Okay. Corey says, the dragon is chaos. The ego is persona's self-defense mechanism. Well, I think that chaos has gotten a bad name from Jordan Peterson because he wrote this book called The 12 Rules of Life. The logos is the antidote to chaos. And the problem is that we have the psychic energy points, which is that, you know, nothing happens without psychic energy. And we don't need to be protected from it all the time. What we need is to develop a strong ego through the Job archetype, which allows us to control. And so if you look at 1 John, okay, 1 John, let me put this citation on here. 1 John, this is the first letter of John, 4:1, okay? And so this is a citation that comes at the end of the Bible, and it basically says you have to test the spirits. And so you have two spirits coming up in your psyche. One is good and one is evil. You can think of it as that, but it can be any set of opposites, actually. And you have to, in your ego, because you have to live in the 21st century, not 100,000 years ago, which is where your instincts come from, and farther back than that. So your ego has to decide whether what's coming up is appropriate for the 21st century. That's the issue. And so it's, you don't want to be totally protected from that, because if you were totally protected of it, we wouldn't reproduce. But but at the same time, we have to, if we're going to live in modern society, then we have to follow certain mores, and that's the condition. You know, this is what, you know, apparently Roger Stone didn't quite understand. He's a guy who wants to be always on the shadow side, and that's the way he played his life. And it'll be interesting to see how it ultimately plays out. The dragon. All right, so when you say that the dragon is chaos, let's say that in evolution, we have within us, in our unconscious, what Dr. Jung called the 2 million year old man, but it's actually 3.5 billion year old man, because every single one of us is descended from single-celled organisms, and every one of those organisms from 3.5 billion years ago to today has successfully reproduced. That's what we are. And so we have naturally in us instincts that keep us going and allow us to grow into being modern human beings. And so that isn't chaotic. I mean, over 3.5 billion years, we unconsciously know a lot of things that we need to know, like how does our heart beat, and how do our lungs work and that sort of thing, but it's all unconscious, and so is a great part of the psyche. And so the question when we relate to things that do come into consciousness is what things are appropriate for the 21st century, because we have to live in the 21st century. Our 2 million year old man, our 3.5 billion year old man or woman doesn't. Okay, that being, which is in our unconscious, the model year of that being was the year of your birth, after no development. And so then it's for your conscious ego to decide what's appropriate from that and what is not. And so Nicholas says Journey into the Self is a book based on the story of Pilgrim's Progress. Yeah, okay. Fist Kid Alex, please come back to your great self and ditch the possession of your wise old man. Your intellect seems fascinating yet guided in a Faustian descent. Or Phineas. Okay, I'm going to stay out of that. If you're mental health professionals, please help one another. Martin, yes, no, extroverted intuition is all about possibilities. We'll take intuitive risks as some perhaps would see them. Tor says Norse mythology does not have a smithing god. Smithing is done by the dwarfs, who have their own realm. Well, ironically, Hephaestus, who is Vulcan in the Roman sense, was also a dwarf. He wasn't a dwarf. He was a cripple, and so the smithing archetype has the cripple within it. And as of now, I have a handicap hang tag for my car because I have a new knee and a new ankle in the last year and a half. And Corey says, from the integration of chaos dragging comes wisdom. That's true. And that integration is often caused by a defeat, which is where the Job archetype comes in. In the Eastern tradition, the koi swims upstream through the dragging gate and is born. Okay, yeah, I'm not familiar with that, but that I should be, I suppose, because of my time in Japan. I know I've seen a lot of koi in my time. Martin says, I think Peterson got stuck due to identity politics, and groups did like the idea of chaos as feminine and masculine order. Yeah, they politicized it. That's true. But, to his credit, Jordan Peterson hasn't gone down that road. I mean, he could have gone off on a bad tangent and gone into politics, but he didn't do that. And he's stayed pretty right down the middle in terms of his perception and what he has been saying as a clinical psychologist. So I give him very high marks for that. And Corey says the reptilian brain, the mammalian, the ape, the prefrontal cortex, the brainstem cord is like the insect brain, which controls all those auto systems. Yeah, it is. Those are all auto systems that work perfectly well unconsciously. Nicholas, understanding the Job archetype and applying it to life can open a person up to the deeper meaning of life's struggles. It's a switch in attitude and perspective. But to help someone heal themselves, you have to ask them to give up what made them sick and hate and fear. Yeah, I suppose. What I would say is that
You know, the Job archetype, when I first came across it and understood it, it was quite surprising to me, but I was doing it naturally. So there's a video on this channel called "How to Experience an Authentic Life," and in that video, you can hear me talk about when I was running a business in Japan, for example, and all the businesses that I've run since then. And so now for more than 30 years, I've always asked, what's the largest mistake you ever made? And in that video, you can hear one of my local subscribers saying, "Oh man, can you imagine trying to answer that question? You know, what's the biggest mistake you ever made?" But the point is that if you haven't made a big mistake, you haven't learned anything. And, you know, if people tell you that they made some small mistake, then you know they're lying. And you know, if they're strong enough to tell you a big mistake, you know, number one, that they learned something from it. You don't necessarily know what, but you know they learned something from it, and you know that their ego would have regenerated after that, and so they have a strong enough ego to handle the job, let's say. And so Corey says, Nicholas F., in the Eastern tradition, people are like monkeys who hold on to shiny things which snare them. Ally, they need to do this. Detaches, let go. Nicholas, I think that's a fairly unfair comment. Could you tell us what your experience in the Eastern tradition is? Have you ever lived in the Orient? Are you a practitioner of an Eastern religion? You know, I'm not going to support that comment. And you know, I've worked 10 years in the Far East and in India and Saudi Arabia, and Eric Fromm says, in The Forgotten Language, speaking about dream symbology, says that Jung dogmatically thinks only of dreams in terms of religious symbolism. Would you agree? I wouldn't say that, because it was a very long time before I even really understood that he even had any interest in religion. And yeah, Corey said that. Corey says, well, they say suffering is from attachments. Yes, that's true. And you know, I mean, I'm just not going to comment on your comment. You know, if you're going to say such things, you really need to grow up. Piss Take Kid says, Skip, would you consider, or have you already spoken of your times living in other countries and your experiences thereof? I do from time to time tell an anecdote, but I haven't really tried to do it in an organized way. I might consider doing it at some point in the future, perhaps in a Monday evening. session. I'll have to think about that one. But it's not that I would avoid doing it. I'd certainly be happy to do it. I have a lot of experiences that are what all of you might not have expect, because most of you have formed your opinions of other peoples and other countries based on either movies or television or cable news or something like that. And in that sense, those things are very harmful. And but those media are also very necessary for us to spin ourselves up, to educate ourselves in the modern world, because the world is so complicated as compared to 300 or 400 years ago. I often point out that there's a statistic that says the average person of the 16th century was only exposed to as much information as we today have in one edition of the Sunday New York Times, and that was only 400 years ago. And so now we have so much more information that we're exposed to day in and day out. And so we have to learn through television and movies and so on, and they're a good tool, but they also very often create stereotypes that are not right. And so, one of the things that Dr. Jung wanted people to do was to develop their own morality, and that means experience from experience. And so anyway, Martin says, I think he did not mean they were monkeys, but say people are like, and perhaps because of the attraction of shining things. Okay, Martin, let's just leave that. Okay, I don't want to go into that anymore. Okay, Corey, if you're going to continue on this line of discussion, I'm going to ban you from the channel. Okay, very simply. Okay, these sorts of stereotypes are not welcome here. And if you continue to do that, you will be banned. You are officially warned in front of quite a number of witnesses, and we don't need to be apologetic about it. You're not acceptable here when you do that. And so, okay. On that happy note, I'm going to terminate for today, and I will be available tomorrow evening at 8 p.m. for the regular weekly meeting. Jasper says, hello, Donald. Just want to thank you for the great work you're doing. Thank you, Jasper. I appreciate that very much. And so, anyway, I need to go back to my regular life, my physical world life, and so I will excuse myself now. So have a great Sunday evening, everyone.